The year is 1750, and young George Washington is making his way to the Ohio Valley to confront the French and ask them to leave. He stops at a trading post and is welcomed by the French to talk. Washington gives his message and asks the French to leave the Ohio Territory. The French say no, and Washington is sent back. Washington makes an alliance with Iroquois half-king Tenagrisson to gain support against France. A British colonial trading post is being established in what's known as the Forks of the Ohio. However, the French arrive at the forks to expel the colonial traders. The Joseph Pierre de Céloron plaque supported that the French ruled the Ohio country and was the reason Washington was sent to argue that fact. The half-king feels humiliated that the colonists are not retaliating, and it looks like he backed the wrong side. To even the score, Tenagrisson and Washington ambush a small French squad. All this brutality for this one-liner. "Thou you art not dead yet, my father." The half-king knew this was wrong, but he did it because he knew that all the heat would go on Washington. The young Virginia man writes to his commander, Joshua Fry, requesting artillery and reinforcements because he knew that the French were going to strike back hard. In the great meadows of the Forks of the Ohio, Washington's men build the very weak Fort Necessity. He asks Tenagrisson to stand and fight with them, but the half-king refuses due to the pathetic looks of Fort Necessity. Thus, he loses his only Indian ally. The French, however, didn't have that issue. The French and Indian force fires from the jungle and obliterates Washington and his men. With no chance of striking back at the French, Washington surrenders and retreats back to Virginia. Probably the worst 4th of July ever. The tragic siege at Fort Necessity was inevitable, but British General Edward Braddock had a plan for revenge. After the Albany Plan of Union, Braddock says to Franklin that "Savages may indeed be a formidable weapon for your raw American militia, but upon the King's regular and disciplined troops, sir, it's impossible they should make any impression." He was so wrong. On July 9th, the British marched to Fort Duquesne on a narrow road, but the French opened fire along with formidable Indian snipers from the jungle. The ground bled as British redcoats dropped in confusion, so confused that they frequently shot cannon volleys into themselves. Braddock bravely trying to redirect his men's fire, tragically dying trying to do so. His men hastily bury him and retreat, making it the greatest British loss ever. In 1756, the war spreads to Europe. Minorca, Britain's main naval base in the Mediterranean, was under heavy French attack. The main relief squadron, led by John Byng, was sent to defend Minorca from the concentrated French naval force. The British, seeming outgunned, fire completely out of range, paving the time for the French volleys to fire back with much greater effect. Foolish Byng considers a retreat and moves his flaming ship away, leaving Minorca completely defenseless. The French storm and seize Minorca, only making it look like a French win was truly inevitable. When it all looked lost, Britain's Secretary of State William Pitt still had hope. He had a plan to win the war, but needed more colonial participation. In Massachusetts, Governor Pownall receives the letters of hope from Pitt, indicating a change in British leadership. That consisted of Colonel Jeffrey Amherst, Commander John Forbes, and the very famous James Wolfe. Pitt believed in the colonists and encouraged their participation because they were the greatest British power in North America. The colonists agreed as well, and due to that, the colonists responded with alacrity and raised many colonial militiamen with their assemblies. Pitt created a system that promoted the military initiative against France, and also encouraged Britain's allies to rise together and help them do that. The important efforts of William Pitt entirely helped turn the tide of the war. In 1758, Amherst and Wolfe decide to attack Louisburg, but the only way to breach it was from shore. Attacking from shore was attacking under heavy fire, which resulted in many British casualties. Although that was the case, the Redcoats overwhelmed the French and forced them to retreat behind the city walls. This gave time for Amherst's men to set up cannons and mortars for the second wave. His men were ordered to dig up trenches on the shore, which made the siege far less risky. After a while, British volleys pounded Louisburg's walls and later forced the French to surrender. Amherst succeeds, and the British begin to win. Although Louisbourg was a success, the colonies were still under threat from Indian raiders. Luckily, Commander John Forbes had a plan to take it down. Forbes made sure he was supported by Indian allies. He also modified the route to Fort Duquesne that Braddock took, and made sure he could regroup his men on the way. Forbes regroups at Fort Ligonier so that he could confidently proceed onward. The French got a good surprise of an enormous column of British soldiers at Fort Duquesne. Surprised at the sight of it, the French and their Indian allies flee from the fort, leaving their only settlement in the forks of the Ohio to the British. It was just a small firefight before the British stormed and seized Fort Duquesne. That meant that the path to Quebec was finally open. Quebec was the most heavily fortified French stronghold along the St. Lawrence River. The man elected to take it down was none other than James Wolfe. Wolfe searches, but unfortunately can't find a path to the heavily fortified French city. "I have changed my measures and laid waste to the country," he says, after he orders his men to burn all the villages outside Quebec. Finally, Wolfe gets the break he deserves and finds a western route to Quebec. That route made it easy for Wolfe's men to move the artillery and cannons up undetected. And by morning, on what's known as the Plains of Abraham, Montcalm was pleasantly surprised. The French, startled, fire out of range. The British don't even care to move. But after the French begin their bayonet charge, the British, outnumbered, opened fire and trapped the French right on the spot. A myriad of bluecoats drop and fill up the plain, so after suffering heavy casualties, Montcalm and his fellow injured soldiers retreat. This was the last major battle of the war, and Britain was the victor. However, Wolfe, severely injured, dies from his wounds on the battlefield. His tragic death marked the inevitable end of the war. Finally, in 1763, the French signed the Treaty of Paris. That treaty gave Britain numerous gifts for winning, such as control of French Canada, Spanish Florida, and the Ohio Territory. The French, however, sadly lost all their North American claims. The British colonists celebrated alongside Britain, only for them to undergo a tragedy later on. When the colonists came to settle in what we know as Detroit, they were met by a French Indian resistance. The Native American Brigade, led by Ottumwa Chief Pontiac, remained loyal to the French and was here to defend their claims. This led to be called Pontiac's Rebellion. They fought valiantly, but the siege of the colonial militia was too much for them. British Parliament takes notice of this and passes the Proclamation Act of 1763, declaring the West Appalachian region Indian Territory. This created angry colonists and pushed them further toward their war for independence.